completed the analysis of what in legal language means a good. So a value, both tangible or intangible, that can be marketed. We center the whole discussion on how it is possible to distinguish an entity which is good to the law by an entity which is not. We said that as for the material objects, basically everything that surrounds us is a good law, apart from very rare situations like the goods that are not scarce resources, or goods having material substance, but that we cannot actually consider a good to the law because of the connection, because of the collision, because of the consideration of human rights. And that's the situation of the body, the human body, and the doubts whether parts of our body can be considered actually goods to law. As for the intangible values, we said that here the definition of what is actually a good to the law is more important or more relevant than the tangible things, because not everything that is intangible can be a good to the law, of course, because here we need at first to define, to put the situation into a frame, to determine the territory that we're talking about. And so here is particularly important to use the marketability test. So the idea that a good to the law, in particular an intangible, can be considered as such if someone is available to pay a sum of money for it. So if the market is telling us that an intangible value an intangible something has a value, in the same, let's say, for the same reasoning, the same perspective of the tangible things, even intangible entities can be considered as goods. So both tangible and intangible things can be defined as every entity that has a value according to the markets. And the market, we know, can change in considering what is valuable and what is not. It is up to the law to define the rules applicable over goods, but the law usually is not interested in delivering an autonomous definition of good, autonomous than the definition of the market. The market is able enough to define what is going to be considered good. Okay, there are the interaction in some cases of the discourse of a human rights. We mentioned that at the end of the last lecture, analyzing the situation of the body parts. So there are, of course, the body as a whole cannot be considered a good for many reasons, but parts of the body not affecting the physical integrity can be considered as good to the law, and can be considered as legitimate object to be put into the market, but bearing in mind that the market defines what a good can be or not, without any consideration of the legal framework we are dealing with. Black market, we mentioned as a clear example of the fact that out there are people, the market is not an entity, of course, and there's no authority defining what a market is. The market is the result of the offer and demand. And so if there are people available to consider as valuable goods, the law must take that into consideration. So reflect on that for a second. The reason why the law is not interested to give a definition of what a good is, and it's just ways for the market to define it. So the traffic, the practice of the market to define it is not because the law is not interested. It is not because the law feels not having enough power to define it in contrast or in alternative with the market, but just for a consideration, a practical consideration. The fact that the law is going to define something as a good and something else as not is not going to impede. That's the story. That's the reality. It's not going to impede someone out there to consider that something as a good to the law. So the law is better off to look at the market and regulate the market as the market is. It's not a matter of just respecting the market, which is partially an answer to the question why the law is not interested in defining the market. In a certain perspective, the law is not interested in regulating the market because the law is respecting the market. In modern economies, modern competitive economies, the law is usually not intervening directly in defining the streams of evolution of the market. The law defines the rules according to which the market as a whole, and in particular certain sectors, particularly delicate because they are affecting us as members of the societies, because they are dealing with public services, for example. There, the density of the regulation of the law is higher. But another reason why the law is not interested to define the markets, to define what is the object of interest of the market, is because the law is not, let's say, interested in putting that in writing. What the law is really interested in is to analyze the stream of evolution of the markets and decide whether certain streams are allowable or not, or desirable or not. Allowable and desirable, of course, not with reference to an abstract and one and forever standard, but according to what the majority of the population, the majority of the citizens, the majority of the members of the community are thinking in that specific moment of the evolution of the societies. So the parliaments are interpreting the wills of the society in considering or not desirable that a certain value that the market is available to consider as a good can actually be marketed. And that's why the law, when the answer is no, is not, the approach is not, okay, this something cannot be considered as a good. No, the law is limiting or prohibiting directly the operation, the marketability, so the contracts, the negotiation, the transactions over these goods. The law is not there to determine the way the market evolves and the way the market is going to change. This is part of the reality that the law is asked to decipher and regulate, not define. The law is not there to define the market and its objects. So marketability is the key word to understand whether or not something is good to the law. The market is the player that's in defining what a good is to the law. The role of the law is to regulate it by defining rules on how it is possible to transmit the availability of goods. How is it possible to defend our interests over goods?